So the Building Bridges project was aimed at looking at the 28 national perspectives on the European Union and basically trying to figure out why countries are part of the European Union and what their expectations are about the future of the European Union. And we had this almost ambitious idea at the beginning of maybe trying to find one or two political projects that could be projected at the European level to reignite, to a certain extent, the European project in the eyes of the European citizens. And in a nutshell, we didn't find any. But we found three main trends that are quite interesting to look at. The first one is that basically the European Union is still a place where people go to find solutions, especially on the economic crisis. So this is more specific to the Eurozone countries, but it's quite important, and it came out very frequently. You may have differences on what the European Union should do and how the EU and the EU level in particular should treat the different countries. Some consider that flexibility should be at the heart of the approach, and others consider that if you want solidarity and help and assistance, you need to abide by the rules, and if you don't, then you cannot expect other member states to come to your help. So this is a very classical debate that we've seen in the past few years. But even after all those years of the Greek crisis, etc., we can see that this debate is still very fierce in member states. The second main trend is that basically the EU should deliver. There is a lot of expectation on the EU, and citizens in general have the feeling that the EU doesn't do enough. It spends a lot of time talking about something, and there is this feeling that the EU talks a lot but doesn't do enough. So the EU should deliver, and really its legitimacy is assessed on the basis of the projects that actually are achieved. And there are two projects that came very often in the different contributions. One is the energy union. The other one is the digital single markets. Those are perceived as quite tangible and positive projects for the EU. The last main trend was perhaps the most surprising, and it's the fact that there is a growing appeal for more common actions in foreign policy and in defense as well. Common actions, but also common policies. It's quite surprising because it's been very often shown in polls that the Europeans are in favor of a common foreign and defense policy, but usually there is this obstacle of the reality. But it seems that maybe because of a lack of resources, maybe because the time is ripe, but at the end of the day, there is a growing appeal for common foreign and security policy at the European level, more common at least. And then there may be differences in terms of priorities. And then there are two less prominent trends. The first one is what is often called social Europe. So all components that deal with social policy, minimum wage, and you name it really. But it's not as frequent as the first three trends that I described. And the other one was very overwhelming in the different contributions. That's the refugee crisis and what the EU should do in terms of a common migration policy, a common asylum policy, and the fact that the EU should try to sort out this situation. But because the project was happening during the refugee crisis, it's quite difficult to know whether this is a make or break situation, and the EU will really be assessed based on its capacity to respond to the crisis, or whether it's very contextual, and hopefully if the refugee crisis winds down, then the urge for the EU to act will wind down as well. There are two very important elements that came out in pretty much all the contributions in the different papers. It's the fact that the EU is more talked about than ever at the national level, but also very often in a critical tone. What it means is that the Eurosceptic arguments really have spread across the continent in very different ways. In some countries it comes in the form of radical right, radical left. In some countries mainstream parties. In some others it's part of the society and the main debate, but not necessarily at the political level. But overall it means that there is a lot more criticisms. There are a lot more criticisms on the EU than ever before. And it comes back to the issue of delivery that I mentioned earlier. The second element is that almost paradoxically, to a certain extent, yes, the EU is more talked about, but still the EU is relatively marginal in national debates compared to other main issues such as job, health, etc. And there are four ways that are often mentioned in different contributions to try to fix this situation and try basically to have the EU more at the core of national debates. One is the role of schools. Very frequently it's mentioned that the EU is not a topic that is often discussed during school years. It's more studied at the university level, but not everyone goes to university. The second one is the role of exchange programs. Obviously the most well-known is the Erasmus, again for university students, but there are also other Erasmus programs that exist and other exchange programs, and those should be expanded to make it more accessible to more Europeans, basically. The third one is the role of the media. Yes, the media talk a lot more about the EU, but because they started to talk a lot more about the EU during the crisis, usually the coverage is quite negative, and there may be a need to have more educational coverages of what the EU does, what the decisions imply, etc. And this is something that could be done in a more sustainable way. And the last avenue is the role of the civil society, and there, I mean, there is. It's one thing to expect national politicians, the media, etc., to talk more about the EU, but there is a very central role that the civil society can play. NGOs, think tank, universities, etc. You name it, really. But the idea is that. It can also be a grassroots movement. It doesn't have to be a top-down coming from the politicians. In conclusion, the project doesn't show how ambitious the EU is today, and probably doesn't reflect the political dimension of the EU as a similar project would have portrayed 10 years ago. What it shows is that there is still a willingness to trust the EU, to believe in the EU, but there is also a growing desire to see the EU deliver on things that are important for the citizens. And on that particular point, there is a shortage. So maybe the conclusions of the project are a little bit disheartening to a certain extent, but it shows that you cannot expect to move ahead and to move forward and to talk about grand political projects if you do not address the needs that are specified in this project, and one of those being that the EU should deliver on urgent priorities that the citizens have pointed out. It's possible to do the two in parallel, but it's impossible, or at least you would have the beginning of the end, really, if you talk about grand projects and you leave behind the more short-term, maybe short-term, yes, but very important projects that need to show results.